Welcome to Dolby Creator Talks. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Today, we welcome back to the show acclaimed horror filmmaker Lee Cronin, along with his sound designer and supervising sound editor, Peter Albrechtsen. We had a really fun conversation with these guys when they joined us back in 2023 in Austin, Texas, at Dolby House at South by Southwest. We talked about their work on Evil Dead Rise, which had just premiered the night before. Now they're back on Dolby Creator Talks with their new delightfully gore horror fest. I'm talking, of course, about Lee Cronin's The Mummy. If you've seen the film, then you already know it is graphic, and that's some of the fun of these kind of movies. But if you haven't seen it and you're squeamish, be forewarned. You might never be able to get a pedicure without thinking about this movie. And while we're on the subject of content warnings, we've done our best to avoid major spoilers, but there's really no way to discuss this film without giving away some of the more fun scares and surprises. So if you haven't seen it yet, you might want to hit pause and check it out now as it's currently in theaters, which is really the ideal place to watch a movie like this. Trust me, the audience reactions are incredible. I wanted to start today's conversation by asking Lee about his decision to take on another iconic horror franchise after having had such a success with Evil Dead Rise. Here's writer and director Lee Cronin.
The unknowns, in a lot of ways, was very appealing to me. I was a fan from childhood of the Evil Dead movies and always harbored a certain ambition to, if given the opportunity to make one. Especially when I never thought they'd do more with them, but then when Fede made his movie in 2013, I thought, I'd love to have a go at one of those. And so in entering that, I always view everything I make, even if it's connected to something that's come before, it's my own movie, it's my own world, and you treat it that way. But the Mummy was interesting to me because it wasn't something I had a burning ambition or desire. And I tend to react a little bit to what I've done before, and try and pivot in some way. And although this movie has my style in terms of how I approach gore and horror, it wasn't like I have a wall full of Mummy DVDs of all these different iterations over the years. I know the movies as well as anybody that loves genre full stop, but they weren't necessarily it wasn't, and that interested me. I was like, okay, that's a challenge where I'm not, it's not that I'm not a fan, that sounds too dramatic, but I'm not I'm not completely versed with this world, and I wanted to take on something that maybe wasn't in my DNA as much, and the opportunity then to subvert expectations and tell a story in a different way using some familiar motifs and kind of concepts was super appealing to me.
You guys collaborated so successfully on Evil Dead Rise. So at what point did you draw Peter into the process and start to think about the sound design for what The Mummy could possibly be?
Pretty early. We should go back in our messages and find out when. I know when we finished Evil Dead, I was toying with a couple of other projects as well. So I know I'd often ring Peter, and just be like, look, because if you're working with people that are great in their roles, brilliant HODs, you do want to make them aware of what you're trying to do from early, because they might become unavailable. So you want to have some bait on the hook and keep them engaged. So I know we talked about another project or two, but then I guess, it was kind of around release weekend of Evil Dead Rise, which was 3 years ago. It was April 2023. Just before the writer's strike, I closed a deal for The Mummy, and then I sat on it, obviously, because of the strike.
Oh, because you couldn't write.
Yeah. So it kind of sat there for a little while, which wasn't the worst thing in the world in terms of I just finished promoting a film. So got a moment to catch my breath. And then I had some competing projects, and it was probably around, I wrote the script for The Mummy at the start of 2024. And I guess I would have made Peter aware I was working on this, but I guess I probably shared the first draft with you, Peter, right? Even in all of its roughness, I probably gave you insight into what it was.
Yeah, we have this constant communication, so it's really brilliant to read Lee's scripts because they are filled with sound. I mean, I'm always telling Lee that I get so inspired by the way he writes his scripts because there's so much sound written into the script. And already from the first drafts, this again was a story with a lot of focus on sound.
I wanted to ask you about that because, Lee, you remember you joined us at Dolby House at South by Southwest.
It was great. I remember it well. I still rate the flask that you gave us that day has has been rated as one of the best insulated flasks of all time, just to put that out there. It's still in use.
It's the little things that make a big difference. But I remember when we had that conversation, I think it was so crazy because I think it was the day after your premiere.
I think so, yeah.
We had that conversation. You talked about, obviously how important the sound design is to the film, but you talked about being aware and thinking about sound as you were writing the script. So I wanted to ask you about that. What were you thinking about in terms of the sound design and what you were going to task Peter with as you were writing The Mummy?
I think it's always part of the design, because the way that I write, there's a couple of different things that are relevant. So the first thing is certainly as I've developed my own style over time, no action description goes above 2 lines. So it's very, very tuned, the screenplay. But within that as well, the other thing within that world that I sometimes break form with would be describing sound maybe in like a singular word or a rhythm. So it's a rhythmic thing for me. And why I'm talking about these little couplets that I write is that's also just part of the structure. I'm kind of directing it. I know people say don't direct on the page, but if you're a writer-director, you're writing to direct it. I'm creating this blueprint. And within that blueprint, I always want there to be some sort of word-based engagement with how I hear the movie as much as what I'm explaining that I see. But I think a lot of the sound that I would write in is, again, quite in relation to rhythmic stuff, and trying to use just words to describe sound that might also play a part in tension. So like I could get caught up in the real specificity of like click, 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 or bang, 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 and thinking about how many there should be. Now that chops and changes, you shoot the movie, you go into sound design or whatever, but the intent is there from really early on to try and give an impression of what that sound is going to do to a scene or to a particular sequence.
Peter, what was your reaction to reading that first draft of the script? Was there anything you remember that you were particularly excited about, or were there any kind of like, oh my God, how am I going to pull this off?
I mean, I really loved the scope and the ambition of it. I remember, Lee, you were saying like, this is a very different beast, Peter. Yeah. And it is, like, in the way that it just where Evil Dead Rise was like one location, one day and night, like it was like very kind of limited in that way. Then this film has a wide scope, like both geographically, time-wise, character-wise. There's of course it's still the focus is on this family, but there's also a detective story going on, and the amount of environments that we go throughout the film is vast. So there's a lot of things to work on. And when I read Lee's scripts, I see them almost like a grocery list, like, oh, okay, so I need to get hold of that sound and that sound and that sound. So it's just amazing to be part of it so early, because then I get this library of sounds that I then pass on to the picture editor, Brian Shaw, so that he has sounds to work with from the beginning.
It's interesting because this movie, every experience is different, and I love the edit. I love when I get into the offline and start to work. I actually found the edit on this one quite stressful, because the film was quite large and ambitious, and we had a very, very long assembly, but actually we would have been in big trouble without early sound in it, because of the way it was written and the nature of it and how the tension needed to be built. At times it was quite hard to find the shape of scenes without sound that was very, very clear in its signposting of where we were heading ultimately. Sometimes you're cutting something and you can just dig into a bit of a library, but quite early on we actually needed design to help us craft the sequences.
So Peter, does that mean so you were working on some specific sequences and handing stuff off to the picture department? I did have a question for you, Lee, that like, were there any specific sequences that like just were not coming together in the edit until you started to hear some of the sound come together for them?
Do you know what was interesting actually, Glenn, was that it wasn't the sequences you think wouldn't work. It was sometimes actually some of the things that were more everyday that we were struggling a little bit to find a personality for, and always wanting to have something within the movie that's a constant reminder you're in a horror film. So sometimes it was even atmospherics and textural stuff. Like there's a scene in the movie with there's a couple of scenes with Morse code, but there's one involving Morse code with teeth. And it actually cut really well without us having to have the bespoke sound there. Got way better when we put the sound actually in. But even actually, there's one scene where it's a dialogue scene between Charlie Caan and the dad. He's sitting in an home office at night in New Mexico, and he's talking to this cop, Zaki, and she's over in Cairo in the daytime, and she moves from inside her office to outside her office. And even it was really hard to know if we had the rhythm of because when you shoot a scene like that, I write it and go, I'll be on this character for this line, and I write it that way, but I would naturally shoot a bit, more broadly, that I wouldn't grab one line and go, cut, I'm definitely not going to use that. You shoot the scene both sides. So there was a lot of opportunity there. And I remember feeling, until quite late in the edit, until we actually had the right atmos and feeling, it was actually hard to know if the game of ping pong between the two characters was right. So it wasn't always about, the obvious, like we need bang, bang, bangs and the thump of a door. You can have things that are indicative, but sometimes it was tonal stuff, because these sort of scenes really relied on the bringing together of both the performance and the visual, but the atmosphere as well.
So I started out on the film, I think a week after Brian Shaw started the picture editing. Brian was like, Peter, you need to do sounds for these things, otherwise I can't edit the movie. So I started doing these sketches very, very early on, and then just sending things over, and then sharing that with Brian in stems so he could split things out. And kind of sometimes Brian did amazing things with just taking something that wasn't at one place and then putting it into another place. And Lee and Brian are so creative with that. And for me, it's about kind of putting a lot of sound into their kind of toolbox, so it becomes a part of the kind of the creative storytelling of the film.
I'm really glad that you guys have brought this up, because I had a note to myself that, obviously there's some big set pieces in the film, and we'll talk about those moments, but I love the way you guys use sound just to kind of contribute to mood and tone and, texture, as you say. Lee, there was, I made a note to myself. So when I watch these movies, I'm just scrawling in my little notebook, and I can barely read it afterwards. But there's a scene where right after they get Katie back to the house in Albuquerque, where they're taking her up the stairs in her wheelchair, and it was so present. It was such an interesting way to use sound in that moment. And I just wrote in my little notebook, going up the stairs, it was like, Peter went a little crazy here. It was such a great moment. Cause in that way, you're telling the audience, it's this kind of mundane thing that's happening, but the way you use sound is unsettling to the audience. And you're telling them you just get this sense of some bad shit's going to go down.
Yeah. I think with something like that, I quite like exaggeration in those areas, because I think it does create a tension. Because on the one hand, now it's not every day that you bring home a daughter and bring her up the stairs in a wheelchair, but there's lots of people that, for a variety of reasons might be dealing with someone that's disabled in their home, or an elderly person or whatever. And I just wanted to take that kind of moment and really push it and be quite expressive. It's a really good example of sound in the script, because I would have written each ka-clunk, 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 ka-clunk of the wheels. But one of the things that it's one of those things, funny, it was very clear in my mind, and we never got it the way I wrote it, but it's better the way we ended up, was that I always wanted you to hear this banging ka-clunk, ka-clunk, ka-clunk as a pre-lap over the scene beforehand. That's how I'd written it. So we're on Katie's face in the car, and then you'd hear da-dunk, 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 and then you'd cut to the wheelchair. But for two reasons. One, when we cut in, I needed her to, the way the set was designed, I didn't have enough steps on the first rise to get enough ka-clunks before I cut to the image. Which, this is the interesting thing. I thought, you would hear bang, 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 then we'll cut in and I can have another 5 of these. But actually, if I use bangs on the pre-lap, by the time I cut to the picture, she'd be up the first part of the stairs, so I can't visually tell that story. Funny, the little things that hem you in, all based on a design. And the design was right, but it has an impact on what we're doing when we're editing. It has an impact on what we're doing with sound design. But then also, the way we built tension in the scene that I didn't originally envisage the pre-lap playing out was much more interesting to actually sit with that moment and the awkwardness, because it builds up to the grandmother Carmen saying, hey, let me see my granddaughter, and we cut inside the car. It's now not the outside atmos, we're inside the car. It feels kind of heavy. She's just breathing. They open the door. There's a little tiny music riser. There's a bit of reactions, and then you come straight. It's a hard cut into bang, that first kind of clunk. But yeah, I think scenes like that, I do like to be just quite expressive, and like I'm not technically proficient in how Peter and his team do their create the witchcraft that they do, but I know how I want to use those tools that they have. So to me, from a sonic point of view, I'm like, I want lots of close-ups. Even if I'm a little bit wider, potentially, I still want the sound to be expressive, like I'm playing that as a close-up. Even if I drop a little wider, I want to get in your head with these effects.
And it's also a way of like establishing already there that, I mean, this tiny girl is actually like, there's a lot of weight in there. There's something in there that's just not, this is not just a tiny little girl. And I really loved that moment for that as well. And like the transition, I think that, I mean, in this film, we did so many transitions with sound that kind of like you start in the previous scene and then you go into the next scene through the sound. And this is like one of these places where like I have this backwards kind of reversed effect of the first hit of the wheelchair, like coming in early. So it kind of sucks you into that next scene. And we do a lot of those things throughout the film, all the time, kind of like playing around with the transitions, and that kind of also makes the storytelling like constantly kind of like, it gives a pace and an energy, but also it gives a dynamic.
And there's a lot of scenes in the movie. We needed to use a lot of tricks. There's a lot of scenes.
I want to follow up something on, Lee, you were just talking about, because I made a note when I was watching the movie that like you use close-ups in a really interesting way to give detail and texture to a space. And it creates all these really interesting opportunities for Peter on sound design. So, I mean, is that something that you're consciously thinking about as you're shooting, to like, I want to grab this to kind of create some opportunities for that? Or what? Just tell me about that part of the process, because it's so interesting to me that like visually you're setting up all these cues for great sound.
I think it's kind of instinctive. Like it's I said, it's there from the script and it's there from early conversations, definitely. But within the design of the scenes visually and then the shooting, which always deviates a little bit from the plans and you're reacting, I'm just always looking for opportunities to refresh the experience. And in a way, I think all of these close-ups and perspectives, like that scene, for example, where they bring up the stairs, brings us into a really interesting scene right afterwards where she's going to bed for being put into bed for the first time. And in some respects, if you just stood back and analyze, you're like, okay, family gather around a bed. There's some close-ups. There's a moment of impact. There's a stunt. You know, there's a supernatural weight that kind of kicks in. But man, like just shooting that scene, there were so many moments and so many things required. And I think even from a sound point of view, then Peter, that was, you know, quite a challenging one to find. It's one that you have to talk about in the wild a lot, where you're envisaging things that are going to take a lot of effort and time to even put into practice to then know if they work really, really well. But it was, yeah. And I guess I am always thinking about, in some respects, what's the job of this shot? And sometimes it doesn't need a sound to denote it. It's not like every moment we go, hey, we cut to a cool close-up, so let's go. But if there's a chance to enhance or to further strengthen the concept behind what I'm showing you, then we're usually all over that.
I love that scene where they put Katie in bed for the first time, and Peter, you had a great moment of there, you know, where we go into Katie's POV and we hear what she's hearing, and it's muted and distorted and just very unsettling. And then, of course, her grandmother speaks Spanish to her. And I feel like that triggers a memory of the magician speaking to her. And then kind of there's this very, visceral moment where she reacts to that. So talk to me, Peter, a little bit about crafting that sequence, because there's a lot going on from a sound design perspective in a very short period of time.
It took a lot of work. I mean, Garrett Farrell, who was supervising the dialogue and mixing the dialogue and music. I mean, me and him, we built up this really like this shorthand when we were doing Evil Dead Rise. Like we are really into playing around creatively with dialogue, and it took a lot of like going back and forth of like how much treatment could we have on the voice and still make it intelligible, and kind of like how much of perspective change should we have, and all of this, and kept on developing throughout the process. I mean, it was something we started out working on in like when for some of the previews, and then it just kept on being refined until the very last moment. And it's really interesting because it's I mean, sometimes when you have a script writer sitting with you who has written all the words down, and then the scriptwriter can become very focused on like, okay, I want to hear every word. But the amazing thing working with Lee is also like, okay, the important thing is also like getting the feeling across. So we can do these treatments, and then like there's specific things we need to hear, but we can also use dialogue as a sound design element, which is amazing for a scene like that.
Tell me a little bit about, your approach to that, to the vocalizations and the sound of Katie, because I love the textures of her breathing and her vocalizations when they first get her back to the house in Albuquerque. But then I feel like as the film progresses and the demon becomes, more of a front and center part of her character, we go on an acoustic journey with her voice, obviously, and the way you're handling her mouth, just her breathing sounds. So talk to me a little bit about that process of figuring out what she was going to sound like, and also kind of mapping out what the journey for that would be.
That was something that took a lot of work. Natalie Grace, who's playing Katie, was just amazing. I mean, just from a physical point of view, like I think she did all her own stunts, Lee, and
yeah, pretty much. Yeah, there's always moments where there's help required, but she was like, I want to do everything as much as is possible. So yeah, she delivered.
Her performance was just amazing. So then when we got to the ADR, I remember Garrett and I sitting there for the first ADR session, and like in comes this tiny girl, and kind of we were saying, okay, can you maybe make some kind of horrific kind of noises, some really raspy breathing and stuff like that? And she, yes, of course. And she just started going crazy, and she made so many great sounds. I think she did 3 ADR sessions just with like kind of demon voices. And it was really amazing how like the backbone of the voice of Katie is really her performance. But then on top of that, I remember, Lee, you were talking about very early on that you wanted a male voice in there. So we did we recorded some, and we wanted some Arabic in there. So we recorded a couple of Arabic voice actors where like Lee wrote down some curses that we got translated into Arabic, and that was like, so we recorded those in Arabic. And then Bob Keller, who was sound effects editor and who really like tuned in on Katie's voice also, like he was sitting there like going through that material and finding parts of the Arabic that somehow fit with the English that Katie was saying, so that like her voice becomes like a part of like the kind of the core of it is Natalie Grace's voice, but then within that is all these Arabic things that, I mean, just parts of sentences and words that are put into into her lines. And then on top of that, there's all the breathings and efforts, which like she did some of that, but it was also, again, like cutting in and out of her breathings and a lot of animalistic things. We even had Lee's dog in there for like some of the press, the licking of the floor. That's Lee's dog.
This is like a 4-pound chihuahua, by the way.
Close mic'd.
You give her some peanut butter, she'll make all the noises in the world.
So it's a mixture of a lot of different elements, but you're right that it was important to have that kind of trajectory throughout the film where the voice really develops.
Peter, I know that you've been influenced in your sound design by the work of Randy Tom, who we both know quite well. And Randy, has obviously written at length about this idea of how to design a movie for sound, and to use sound as a storytelling tool. And one of the ideas that I've always been struck by that he talks about and Lee, you were just talking about this a minute ago, is the idea of using the visual and the production design of the film to create these opportunities for sound. And I feel like I could teach a class on using your film, because you've got such a great example of this, Lee, in these, the house in Albuquerque. You designed it with these crazy, insane crawl spaces, between the walls and then between the floors. And that just opens up so many possibilities for extraordinary sound design. I'm thinking about that sequence with Sebastian and Maud, where they're hearing Katie in the walls moving around the house. And obviously, I'm delighted by that, because it's an amazing moment in Dolby Atmos as well. So, I mean, where did that idea come from to kind of create those crawl spaces and kind of open up those great opportunities for sound design?
With a movie like this, there's the core family drama, and there's the detective story and the mystery, but there's also the want for spectacle. And I think what you need to try and create is different stages, or obviously the obvious thing is to say different sets, but within your story, different platforms to create a variety of experiences. I think that's kind of what's important. And so, we'd obviously made Evil Dead, which is primarily set in an apartment inside the confines of one particular apartment, and then a corridor. That's about 90% of the film. And again, this movie is also a contained haunted house story on the one hand, but actually there's a lot more going on outside it. But even still, with all of the scope to step out and go back to Egypt and go to, the inside a pyramid that's underground and various different things, I still knew within the house that I needed like variety, because you actually, when you're shooting it, start to run out of ideas kind of quickly. Specifically, are places to put the camera, specifically with the crawl spaces. I don't think it's a thing maybe in the US you have as much, or at least people are saying to me, is like these dormer houses where you have these eaves, you have these voids, and so you don't have any traditional attic space. And I was like, it's pretty cool, because now there's a circuit around the house, and we can play. I remember when I was writing, I was thinking about, with a kid, the way you might play that game of chase around a table. You go one way, you go the other. And it just kind of triggered this idea of, Katie has been missing. Then she vanishes again with inside the home, and she's running laps, and we don't know why she's running laps. And then the interesting thing about it is we hear this before we see it. So it kicks everybody's imagination into gear. They know that something, uncomfortable is going to happen. They know that there's going to be some moments. They know what they're in for. But actually one of my favorite moments in the movie, because I love the fact that we come out of this emotional part where we're showing Mom is, trying to share the past with Katie, like bring her back, remind her, look, you had this bedroom when you were 3 years old, and look at your life, and look at these photographs. And Dad's head is in the mystery of it all. He's down in the basement, and he's looking at evidence. So we're positioning these two characters emotionally about where they're at with their daughter and what they want. And then it's a horror movie, and I go, great, cut to an exterior wide shot, there's a sound of coyotes, bang, a little girl wakes up, because she heard something, maybe. We heard it, she thinks she heard something. And then we start to play with it from there. And we go, okay, now I'm going to bring you in, and I'm going to reward you really from an experience point of view. Thank you for paying attention to the characters, getting drawn into the emotion. Now let's go have some fun. Now let's go have some spectacle with that moment. But the eaves, it was a really difficult set to shoot in. Because everyone came out with a bad back because you were stooped. We built it the proper scale, because it's always like, an actor, Larissa, like Laia, who plays Larissa, Laia Costa, would be like, but it's really awkward in there. And I'm like, exactly. Like, how do I run around it? I don't know. You know what I mean? Figure it out. That's kind of the point. And then it creates the bumps and the bangs and all the speed that you want and all of those kind of moments. But it is very exciting with a sequence like that to, like, I love my traditional scares. Like, you can't beat, it's like a campfire tale, something that goes bump in the night. And I know that was one, Peter, I was getting quite specific at times about what those sounds were like and what we heard and what the movement would sound like and how big something should be at first or how small it needs to be before we go for the bigger one. And I remember even with rough sound design in our first ever test screening we did, everybody got really on it. You were kind of getting the hell no's out of the crowd. It's just like, no, don't go in there. But like, that's what people want. They want you to say there's something scary behind the door that you can hear. Don't open the door. Of course we're going to open the door. That's why you're here. That's why you bought a ticket.
Peter, talk to me about mixing those sequences and how you use Dolby Atmos.
It was just like a playground for sound, because like the thing we do when we're mixing these movies is that one thing is like you have an off-screen sound and it plays from somewhere in the room. But what we also do is that when we're actually in the room, and Lee has this thing like where often like characters kind of like sometimes like leave the frame and then come in again and do these things. So it's, for me, it's almost like the camera is listening in a way. And we kind of, that means that we can pan around sounds while we're in a room so that you get this three-dimensional space, even like in the eaves, like, okay, so she's running down there. It's kind of like it's coming around and then move. So it's really like an amazing opportunity for doing that. And Gabriel Gutierrez, the Spanish mixer who was mixing the effects, he's just like brilliant at these things. He was just sitting there with his panners and kind of moving around.
Even I had a go with them, Peter. You remember? I even had a go. I played with the tools. I'm really bad at it, but
yeah, there's one sound in there that Lee panned.
Yeah, it's probably one of the best in the movie.
Lee brought it up, but I want to ask you about one of my favorite recurring motifs in this film, which is teeth. There's just so many great teeth moments. We got grandma's dentures, which play a very important role in this film for reasons that are very disturbing. And then, of course, obviously, you've got that great Morse code sequence with Katie and how she starts to communicate with her dad. So, tell me about like just even the nuts and bolts of how you approach kind of all this teeth stuff that you had to do in the film.
It was like, again, building it up like layer by layer with a lot of different elements. The Foley artist Quiver Doyle did an amazing job, like just recording things for the teeth and so on. But we also did a lot of extra teeth. Like there's even some teeth of like wolves in there, and like and for the and I was also asking Quiver like specifically to kind of do small scratches, like things like that, which when you then turn them up and you can really feel like, okay, the teeth are like hitting each other. It's really like it's so gross and it's so intense because you hear these tiny little sounds. And then, of course, there's a moment which is one of my favorite sound moments in the film, where Charlie realizes that this is Morse code, and he's kind of like leaning down, and he starts almost like hearing a kind of subsonic version of the Morse code, which Bob Keller, one of the sound effects editors, he did this amazing thing where apparently what he did was that he kind of did a voice thing like, but then he took out, like when you do a really close recording of something, you declick it afterwards to remove the clicks. What he did was that he took only the clicks and then he pitched them down, and then they got this kind of so that it was really like this really powerful texture, but it's also like, both for that and then afterwards, and when he's using his pen, it's these sounds where you're thinking, wow, how exciting can it be to look at someone writing with a pen on a piece of paper? Well, it can be pretty exciting if you add those kinds of
that turns out.
That's a really good example, actually, of where I can write in detail what I want, but you can only be so expressive on the page. And actually, even when you shoot it, you can only be so expressive. It's one of those scenes where you're like, it's not that you find it in the edit because you've gathered everything you need, but it is very much the combination of picture and really clever sound design that allows it to exceed what you can put on the page. Because to read it, you've really got to use your imagination. But it's a great example of a scene that is like elevated tenfold by all of those techniques that Peter just described.
You mentioned a couple times test screenings, and so I'm kind of curious about, Lee, how you use test screenings, what you get out of them. And I imagine with a film like this, it must be particularly challenging to test a film and try to get an audience reaction to it, without some of those, more finished sound elements.
It is a challenge. I think test screenings are really valuable because you do learn. And what it actually is a fun way. There might be some people who go, do a test screening, learn what you can, run away, forget about it. But actually what it's about is continuing to test, because then you really start to notice trends that take place. And sometimes those trends will be counter to what you believe in, and it can actually make you double down on something and go, okay, I really believe in this, or you might learn something in particular. But it's definitely stressful. It's more actually the most stressful aspect of a test screening is the concern around the sound, because you've got this situation where you don't have a lot of time to mix it. Often it's kind of coming out of the Avid and having a fairly rudimentary pass. You have to concede in certain areas that you just won't have the necessary work in play. And I do believe, for me, that the way that I approach things, because it's there from the page, some people might say, oh, like genuinely the last 10% of the work that we do on my films is 50% of the experience at that point. It's kind of enormous. And I experienced it more. It was an interesting process with Evil Dead Rise, where we'd tested the movie. We only tested Evil Dead Rise 3 times. And the first test, as is always with like an R-rated horror movie, was fine. We're all alive. We're not panicking. And then we did a second test screening and we'd improved the score, but still wanted to take the score to it. And that score just equals, it's a snapshot on a day. It's a particular audience, but there's things you can learn. And then all we did with Evil Dead Rise was finish the movie after that test screening. And I didn't get to test it again for months and months and months after that, because it was like we scored pretty well, finished the film. We tested it closer to release time. It was going to help the studio make a decision about strategy, and it went through the roof. And it was, all that changed was we mixed it and we color corrected and we finished the VFX. Maybe there was a 5% difference in the edit, but nothing that was grand. So it does prove that the finishing of a movie, especially one that needs to be so dynamic with its sound. So the Morse code scene is another good example. It can only be so impactful. Or we enter the scene and Katie is clicking, but it's secondary to the emotion that's in the scene in that moment. But we're aware of it. But we become aware of its importance at the same time as Charlie. And it's a really good example again. There's a shot where the camera pushes in towards his ear slowly. We're thinking, what's he hearing? What's he hearing? And his ear twitches a little. And it was always there visually, but it wasn't until we directed the audience with the way the sound was changing to really feel like it was being processed inside his head, that moment then just goes click and engages. And that moment goes click, and therefore when he grabs the notebook and starts trying to do the Morse code, now that's more impactful, the reason behind that, and so on. So sometimes there's these trigger moments that can really change the energy and course. And then the other thing as well, do your best endeavors, with that mixing. And we'd brilliant person working with us, Paul Hackner, out in LA, who was like, knows the movie as well as any of us, and was, working tirelessly to help us that preview. And then you're kind of bouncing to different rooms each time, you're in this cinema and that cinema, and you're like, I even remember the very first, not on this, we were more balanced, but the very first Evil Dead Rise test screening we did, I had a little control box and was just constantly jockeying the levels, because I was like, I think we're too hot. Oh, I think we're too quiet. Is everyone paying attention? I need to make it louder. So picture you can do very little about at that point. It's where the edit is at. Audiences will forgive a grade in a lot of ways, like if you've just got a temp grade, but the sound can really change the course of the experience in meaningful ways.
You just described what a nightmare, giving a director the fader in a screening.
I know. I was fairly calm with it. I kept it. I don't think I ever pushed it past 7. But it was. It is. No one wants to hand it to me.
Let's talk about one of the big set pieces of the film. One of my favorite sequences, the wake for grandmother. There's so much going on in that sequence from a sound design perspective. You kind of start with. It kind of starts with Katie talking with Sebastian through his headphones, which is just an amazing sound design moment. Then that rotting floor that she comes through. And then, of course, just the sheer pandemonium that happens when Katie, shows up during the wake. I'd love for you to talk about some of those elements, but it's actually a really long sequence as well. So, Peter, I'm sure you had to also think about the totality of that sequence and how you were going to build through it as well.
It's really dynamically, built and shaped so that it goes from this really beautiful classical piece, Ave Maria, into something that gets really ugly and disturbing. So there's a lot of shifts up and down. And again, we talked about the house earlier. For me, the house is, it's a character in the film. So we had so many creaks and things, and the acoustics also, so that this way that sometimes we play the acoustics in in a way where where we do it in a realistic way, but there's also a lot of places where we go into like a subjective space with the characters, and we do that several times during that sequence. It's like when the dad is up there in the beginning on like guarding Katie's door, and like he's in his own world. Sebastian comes up, kind of wakes him up almost. Then we go down again, and like there's constantly this shifting focus of like how much of the backgrounds do you hear, like how much do you like then only hear Katie crawling, like that. I mean, we shift the perspectives all the time, and I mean, it's kind of built for that, and kind of like, and in the middle of it, there's this very intimate kind of talk between Charlie and Larissa, which is like this conversation, which is very private and personal. So it has all these elements that go from the craziness of what Sebastian is hearing on the headphones to that quiet, intimate conversation, and then the end where, like, Stephen McKeon, the composer, did this amazing, really distorted string thing, which, like, I remember us being at Stephen's studio together and hearing that for the first time, and we were all like, yes, 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 really excited. And that comes in at the end where, like, it becomes this kind of shift back and forth between his really brutal kind of like hits of noise almost, and then the sounds of the coffin falling and all of those, and it's all very punctual, like something that we have kind of explored since Evil Dead Rises. That, Lee, I feel like you have this thing about like every moment should have kind of a sonic kind of like precision. Like, so instead of like having a wall of noise of all kinds of things, then it's often like build up of like, so this moment has a very precise sonic character, and it has to have like really a character. It's like every little sound in that sense has a personality, but it's kind of like that moment, that moment, that moment, that moment. And it means that instead of just like having a lot of noise playing, it's kind of like, it's all these significant, powerful moments that create this kind of really dynamic soundscape.
Yeah, I love the way it builds. Like, as you said, it's Peter, it starts with Ave Maria, and it's actually quite like emotional, and I know one of the things I talked about, even just how we played that song in the space, was that it just needed to feel a little dreamy, like it's floating on the air. And you're with the emotion of Larissa, whose grief, you know, deep in grief at the loss of her mother. And then we start to introduce more horrific kind of moments, but then we continue to bring the drama in and out, and then slowly the madness takes over. And then, yeah, it's a series of like every single shot is building then this kind of, you know, it's like I'm hitting you with a different power tool each time. It's not just one power tool over and over again. It's just like this different, it's bang, bang, bang. Like it's just, it's quite aggressive by the end. And then we layer in some pretty wild music from Stephen on top. But in some respects, that sequence, it was a killer to shoot. It took some time. But that sequence is almost a little kind of microcosm of the experience of the whole movie. Which is, it does start out a little quieter, but then it builds to a very, very entertainingly aggressive place, I hope, not just aggressive.
Oh, for sure. I love the way you talk about the power tools and hitting people with the power tools. Lee, one of the things I love is I'm always amazed at your ability to take things just a few steps farther than I anticipate is possible. I'm thinking about Evil Dead Rise. I'm thinking about the cheese grater, of course. Mm-hmm. But this time, I mean, I don't know that I'll ever be able to get a pedicure again without thinking about thinking of you, Lee Cronin. But for me, it was like this moment, and it was kind of like almost like a little bit more of a quiet throwaway moment, but the moment with like lapping up the embalming fluid, like I can't believe you went there. Like it's just like you just go a little bit farther than I think is possible, which is I get my question was, why do you do this to us? But I think I know the answer.
It's one of those weird things. If I think of it, sometimes it's hard to not do it. So like, I can't remember the order of how that scene came together. I know the motivation was to present the most, I don't know what the right word is, because I don't want to say like screwed up. That's not kind of the point at all. But I wanted to basically take the concept and, in a weird way, the beauty of Awake, even though it's a very traumatic time. But then the way Carmen's, casket gets tipped over, I was like, I'm literally just I'm going to pull the tablecloth and I'm going to take everything with it, and in doing that, it was like, well, where does it end? It can't just be, oh my goodness, my daughter's here. It was like, she's here for a purpose. And I don't know whether the idea of her drinking the embalming fluid came first, or was that line with the ladies where it's because I love a setup where they talk about embalming fluid being Botox for the dead. And I was like, well, if you're going to, again, it's like, if you're going to walk into the room with a gun, you better shoot it. So if I'm going to talk about how she looks and embalming fluid, well, then the fluid is going to have to spill. And, we've got a demonic mummified girl in our midst. So she's going to be attracted to death. And, there's a motivation kind of, behind all those things. And another actual perfect example of the close-up shot of the licking, which then we see Larissa in the background, it's again, quite a bit of my little chihuahua Lily in there in that moment.
We've talked about sound, and the movie is obviously, it's an amazing experience in Dolby Atmos, but it also looks fantastic in Dolby Vision. Lee, for you, why is it important as a storyteller to have access to those tools like Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos to tell these stories?
Pure and simple, it's accuracy. So it allows you to be very specific and focused on your intent. I guess most filmmakers in some respects are control freaks, and you do have to let go and let your movie go out into the world. But it's always like, I'm always nudging people, it's like, oh, I'm going to go see your movie. I'm like, yeah, go see it in this type of room, go see it in Dolby. And for me, it's a very accurate, from a color point of view, presentation of the movie. It is the place that allows me, because I'm always trying to create these kind of fairground rides. So the ability to play with the positioning of sound within a space, again, with such accuracy, is quite incredible. And when we did the premiere, like, a lot of people talked about the sound after the experience of the movie. They really, really did. And I think it's just a combination of those two things. It gives you a lot of confidence in terms of when you sign off on that look, and because typically the way it works, like you're grading in a more conventional theatrical context, and then you can bring that process into your Dolby Atmos, into that PLF kind of environment, and then see your movie and then tweak off of that where you want to take it and where you want to nail it, and you can then walk out of that space and go, this is exactly how it's going to be in those rooms, and that is really comforting, because at the very least that your full intent is on show. No one's going to play it too low, the projector bulb isn't going to be on its last legs, etc., etc. And look, I get it, it's a wide and varied world with lots of different approaches for theaters, and the most important thing is people are going to theaters no matter what. But I do think there's, as I said, the two occasions I've worked with Dolby, on this and on Evil Dead, you sleep well that night afterwards, because you know that it's all the way you want it to be.
That's great. And I know that it's important to you. Peter sent me a copy of the note that you sent to the projectionist talking about the sound levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's, and like, you can only control so much. And I appreciate, again, within a multiplex, someone might go, yeah, but if I play it at that level in this room, it's going to leak inside, or like our speakers aren't, whatever it might be. But the point is to try and engage with the people, to engage with the people that are out there doing their job, and asking them to help us to continue to do our job as well.
There are so many great sound moments in this movie. Like, we could go for another 2 hours discussing. I'm thinking about scenes like Inspector Zaki sticking her finger in her throat hole in order to give the incantation. There's the plumbing in the house when Larissa takes her bath. I had a note the Nasnamarian audio recording. So many great moments. But I want to just wrap up with giving you guys. You touched on this earlier, but I want to give you a chance to shout out maybe just one of your very favorite sound moments in the film that kind of makes you a little giddy when it comes up in a screening. Peter, you wanna lead us off?
I love the storm sequence in the beginning. a thing that really connects us all on the sound team is that we all have a very kind of musical approach to things. So I loved when working on the kind of the montage that brings you into the university for the first time. You kind of see all these mummified bodies and so on, and that it had kind of this really crazy shape of different sounds distorting. And when Gabriel mixed that for the first time, he was saying, "Peter, this is your Trent Reznor moment." The biggest compliment.
That's great. Lee, how about you?
Oh man, it's kind of hard to pick, because what's interesting with this process was I only finished the movie 5 weeks ago, like 4 weeks before release. So I haven't really come to terms with it, and I haven't seen it. I saw it a lot in its final construction. I haven't seen it that many times fully completed, which with Evil Dead, I'd seen it quite a number of times before it went out into the world. But I think less a moment. I really enjoy where we play with perspective. And there's a good example within a moment. It's after the infamous pedicure sequence, and where that builds and the discovery that Charlie makes with some skin. And I really quite like, there's one particular moment where we're playing with him separating all these layers of skin and these bindings with hieroglyphs on them. And it's kind of like, not that we're playing it normal, but we're kind of playing it to the moment in a kind of natural way. And then there's just one cut where it almost sounds like, I don't even know, it's like jet engine-y kind of. It's just got a big loud expressive moment in the middle of the scene, as if the separation of these things is, again, beyond just the small physical act of what's happening. We give it actually a lot of power and weight and importance. I think that and similar to that is one of my favorite moments is just the hairdryer turning on. When Katie's being beautified, because we come out of an emotional scene, and then we play with this music and we're just staring at her, and then we pull it to silence bar her breathing. And there's nothing's by accident, in the sense that there's that one breath, and then the breath holds, and there's like nothing, and we're all going, what's going to happen? And then we've no idea that a hairdryer is going to come in, literally like an actual jet engine. I think it probably is a jet engine, is it, Peter? There you go.
That's great. That is awesome. Guys, thank you so much. This was a real pleasure. This movie is so much fun. I had a great time seeing it. Lee, Peter, great to have you back on the show talking to us about it. And let's do it again next time when you after the next one.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Many thanks to Lee and Peter for coming back on the show today. As I mentioned up top, Lee Cronin's The Mummy is currently in theaters, so go see it right now. And if you can catch it in a Dolby Cinema, you will not regret it. Or maybe you will. It really depends on whether or not you watch it with a full stomach, since the filmmakers really used Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos to its fullest, grossest potential. You'll find links, as always, in our show notes for tickets. And if you'd like even more conversations with artists and filmmakers about how they use technology to tell their stories, be sure you are subscribed to Dolby Creator Talks. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. If you're curious to know more about what we do at Dolby Creator Lab, head on over to dolbycreatorlab.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of the show, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Kahn. Thanks for joining us.